This is the proper way to interpret Scripture. And if you can agree on this, then let's apply this method to the Bible and to this passage, and let's see what we find. And so it helps us sometimes when there's a disagreement over doctrine that you cannot seem to reconcile, if you step back and say, well, how are you reading the Bible? How are you studying the Bible? Let's start with that. And sometimes you can help the person to step back from that particular passage or step back from that particular doctrinal position that they hold and think more seriously and more freely about how they are reading the Bible. And so sometimes you're able to help them in that way. So the 10 principles of interpretation. The first one says that we should use the grammatical historical method. Now that sounds like a big word, but let me explain it to you, and then I think it will make sense. When we read the Bible, we read it in its grammatical context and its historical context. Now, when I say the grammatical context, I mean how the words are put together in sentences, the meanings of the words, just as you would read a newspaper or just as you would read a textbook. Now, of course, the Bible is unique and special, but what I'm saying is when God inspired the written word, the message is unique, but the method is not unique. In other words, God chose to use human language. And He is using human language in the same way that we use human language to communicate the author's ideas. And so we need to follow the grammatical context, understand the words in the same way that you would, in the ordinary way that you would understand words. In other words, there's not a special code to interpreting the Bible. There's not a secret meaning underneath the words. But you read the words for their ordinary, apparent, normal meaning. You look at the definitions of the words and their relationships to each other and how they're put together in the sentence. That's the grammatical context. You also look at the historical context. You must understand the Bible in the way that it was written at the time. In other words, it's not the modern definition of words, but the words that were chosen when the Bible was written. You have to understand the culture of the time. In order to understand what a certain sentence means in the Bible, you cannot simply come from the 21st century Singaporean experience. You've got to go back to the first century experience and understand, if you're going to understand a parable of Jesus about fishing or about farming, you cannot take our methods of fishing or farming. You have to go back and study the first century methods of fishing and farming. If you're going to read a certain word in the Bible, you cannot take our modern definition. You have to go back and take the ancient definition. So that's the historical context. Now, basically, there are two choices in interpreting the Bible. You can use the method I've just described. Sometimes it's called the literal method because you're trying to take the words literally, the way that they're written, the way you would take ordinary words. But I chose not to use that term literal because sometimes that might be confusing to people. Because the Bible does contain things like figures of speech and so forth. And we're not denying that the Bible would have figures of speech, parables, symbols, and types. But we're simply saying that we must look at the author's intention. You know, in our modern speech, we use symbols and figures of speech. But the key is, what is the intention of the author? Did he intend for this to be a poetic speech or a very literal speech? Did he intend for it to be a figure of speech, or did he intend for it to be very literal? For example, if I tell you today, I've told you 1,000 times to close the door when you come inside. Now, what do I mean when I say that? Do I mean I've counted the number of times and it's equal to exactly 1,000? And so you could raise your hand and say, Brother Bernard, no, you've only said that 997 times, so you're lying. When I say, oh, I'm sorry, I said the wrong thing. No, that's not what I mean. I'm not talking about counting the number of times. I'm using a deliberate exaggeration to emphasize a point. What my meaning is, I've told you this so many times, I shouldn't have to tell you again. That's my meaning, and you understand that's my meaning. So I'm using a figure of speech deliberately. But that's what I intended, that's what you understand, and so the communication has been effective. So that's grammatical, historical interpretation. You're getting at the meaning of the words the way I intended them. The same way with the Bible. If the Bible uses a figure of speech, if the author intends a figure of speech, we interpret it as such. But we're bound by the understanding of the text, the way it was written, the intention of the author. But so when we study the Bible, we basically have one of two choices. We can use this grammatical historical method that I've just described, or we can use what's called the allegorical method. The allegorical method means that you find hidden meanings behind the surface meaning, and you interpret it according to various doctrinal positions. You're actually putting the meaning into the text. And what I'm saying tonight, that's not the correct way to interpret Scripture. If you use that approach, this Bible can mean anything you want it to mean, because you're basing your interpretation on your doctrine. And so how can the Bible instruct you? You're putting your doctrine into the text. How can the Bible correct you? You're the one that's putting the doctrine into the text. Let me give you an example. This was a very prominent method in the early writings of people that's known as the church fathers. And that's one of the problems with the doctrines that have been changed over the years, is they use this allegorical method, which allows you to find any doctrine you want to find in the Scripture. Perhaps you've heard of Augustine, or Augustine is a very prominent writer in the 400s. Well, I'll give you an example. The story in John chapter 21, the Gospel of John chapter 21, where Jesus told the disciples to cast their nets on the other side of the boat, and they caught a great catch of fish, and the total was 153. Remember that story? Well, Augustine said 153. That's an interesting number. In fact, if you've got a little calculator, you can do this. If you take 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5, etc., all the way up to 17, the sum total is 153. So, he said, there must be something significant about the number 17. Well, if you take the number 10 plus 7, you get 17. Well, 10 is the number of the 10 Commandments in the Old Testament, and 7 is the 7 spirits of God in the book of Revelation, signifying the fullness of the New Testament. So he says the purpose of this 153 fish is to show that God is combining the Old Testament and the New Testament together. Well, that's an allegorical interpretation, because you cannot find that just by reading the text. You're bringing your doctrine to the text. Now, I've heard some people say, well, there were 153 nations in the world, and so each fish represents one nation, so the gospel is going to be preached to all the nations. Well, now, you might find another scripture that says it's God's will to preach the gospel to every nation, but that's not what that text says. Now, a grammatical historical interpretation would say, well, there had to be some number. You know, it's a historical account. It's a true story. Why would that number be recorded? Well, for one, it's showing you the large number. It shows the nature of the miracles, a true miracle, because so many fish were caught so quickly. Also, it shows there must have been an eyewitness. Somebody must have counted the fish. So that increases the truthfulness or the believability of the story, because it's obvious this story was told by somebody who was there and who counted the fish. So there is a reason for that number, but the reason is going to be found in the text itself. You cannot just pull a reason out of thin air. You have to have some justification in that text, or at least maybe some other passage that would shed light on that text. Another example is the Catholic writer Jerome. You know the story of the parable of the sower and the 4 types of ground in Matthew 18. And the good ground produced 30-fold, 60-fold, 100-fold. So Jerome said there are 3 types of Christians. The 30-fold people are those who are married. The 60-fold people are those who are widowed. And the 100-fold people are those who never marry. What he was saying is being celibate is the best of all. Well, that's not found in that parable. That parable is not even talking about that. That is a Catholic doctrine put into the text. to try to say that the more holy you are,